Thomas Huddleston, you are the author of a new report into how an intercultural integration approach affects the quality of life of cities. What did you find?
Well, we were interested in looking to see what cities can really do to help newcomers and old residents meet each other, trust each other, and also feel like they're all part of the same city. So what we did is we looked at how the Council of Europe has been promoting an intercultural approach at the local level by looking at what are all the different policies that they're asking to be in place. And we looked to see how having those policies might actually affect your quality of life as a resident, whether you think that immigrants are good for the city, whether you trust the local authority, whether you feel like your city is a safe place, a good place for work. And our research across dozens of cities has found that actually those cities that really have a strong intercultural approach are the places where people feel that they have a very good quality of life.
Okay, so you said that you did research across dozens of cities. What was the methodology behind the project? I mean, how did it come about? Because that's important when we come to analyse the data later in our conversation.
Yeah, so the Council of Europe has created a great set of guidance for how a city can become intercultural. They've looked to see all of the different ways that city administrations can work differently in a more inclusive and participatory way across all of the different city services. And they've turned that into the Intercultural Cities Index, where city authorities actually go and they report which policies they have in place and which they don't. And based on that, you have a simple index that allows you to see which cities have a more intercultural approach and which cities don't. And that's been developed now over several years. It's been expanded to over 100 cities across Europe. And with that data, we could then match it with the best data that we have across Europe, measuring people's well-being. This is the Quality of Life in European Cities survey that's been done by the European Commission, where citizens in dozens of cities across Europe reported again, how safe they felt in their city, how they felt about foreigners in their city, whether they trusted the city administration and thought it was efficient. And then by doing complicated statistical analysis, we were able to see if there was a strong relationship between the policies in place and public opinion. And we even were able to test whether actually this relationship might have been due to other things that you would assume are driving people's well-being outcomes. And even when we controlled for all those things, which we'll talk about later, still we found that policies are linked to good quality of life outcomes.
Thomas, just so we know, what's your own background in this? Have you done this type of research before over such a lengthy period?
So I originally am American, from Boston, from the United States, where we have a very long tradition of trying to understand how our own identity gets changed by being a place of immigration, and how our own cities and states and country can benefit from immigration. So when I came to Europe 10 years ago, I was really interested in whether immigrant integration is working properly across Europe. And here in Europe, we really have a laboratory of different ways of doing things, not only in countries, but also in different parts of countries. So I've been doing research now for the past 10 years at the Migration Policy Group, really looking to see whether the way that we deal with immigrant integration in different European countries actually matters for immigrants' integration. I mean, does it really help them to find a job, to participate in public life, to learn the language? And so I've been really interested in how national policies are improving immigrants' integration, but we're also seeing that what cities can do can also have an impact, and that we also need to think about how these policies help all of us, how they actually help us as members of the public to gain more trust in immigrants and also to improve our own quality of life. So we've now started to look at how immigrant integration policies actually also affect the public and not just immigrants.
So, Thomas, with this experience then of being born in Boston and now working out of Brussels, has the intercultural approach, which is the top line for our conversation today, has this been tried in the United States?
Well, I would first say that I think most of us don't really know what an intercultural approach is. If you talk about integrating immigrants, people can kind of understand some of the basic ways that this could work out. You could just try and ignore that these people are here and exclude them, or you could acknowledge that they're here but really segregate them or ghettoize them. You could say that they're welcome to be here, but they have to become exactly like us. And I don't really want to know anything about your own background or interests. That's kind of more when people talk about assimilation. Or you could say, no, we want to recognize your culture. We want you to participate here, but with your culture. That's usually what people think multiculturalism is. And so when you ask them, well, what is interculturalism? It's actually really none of those things. I mean, interculturalism is actually arguing that we want to have immigrants and non-immigrants meeting and exchanging and participating a lot. We want them to have a common identity, common bonds, but we also want them to recognize that everyone is diverse. Everyone has little bits of who they are that's affected by their group, where they came from, their family, and that to really be able to learn from each other, to have each other's benefit from each other's skills and knowledges, we need to learn a little bit about each other, but we also need to forge a common identity. And so this intercultural approach is something that started in places like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, but it has really been picked up a lot, not only in the English-speaking world, but has been also picked up in many European countries. And I should also add, it's a very pragmatic way of talking about immigrant integration. You know, an intercultural approach we see, for example, is really common in the health sector, where doctors realize, okay, I'm going to have to be interacting with patients who have very different backgrounds, but I need to talk to them about these basic medical needs. So I need to really understand how I'm going to be able to talk to them, but also be able to inform them about how our system works here and how they're going to have to become part of our medical system. So it's a very pragmatic approach that we see starting to build up in the health sector, in the education sector, and we're hoping to see it grow more in the city sector because we can see that it actually seems to have an impact on people's attitudes.
I think what I was driving at with the question, Thomas, was whether interculturalism is something new. Is it a departure from this multicultural approach that we've had since maybe the 1980s, certainly in the UK and maybe the Netherlands? But perhaps what's more interesting as a question would be, was there anything that you found in this research that has surprised you?
I mean, I think what's really interesting for us to be aware of is that to really be an integrated society, we need to be using all parts of our politic, all parts of our services, this vast welfare state that we have in many European countries in order to help us understand each other and work together. So one of the big surprises, I would say, from the study is we found that, you know, if you're living in a city that is really trying to do as much as possible to make the services intercultural, that will help you have a good quality of life in the local level and also help to build some trust in the immigrant population. But if you have a national government that's doing the opposite, that's also having an effect on local residents. It's also having an effect on whether they trust immigrants and also having an effect on how dynamics are working in local areas. So I think we're in a really challenging place in Europe, but also in my experience in the United States, where sometimes we have local authorities who are really pragmatic. You know, they know that they're going to have to deal with a diversity of populations. They have limited resources. They want to work it out in the best way. And many are coming to the intercultural approach because they realize this is a way for us to actually use the resources and skills of the different people in our population and make sure that the city authorities are actually using them to the fullest extent. But at the same time, you know, while local authorities are becoming pragmatic, we also have some national governments that are only thinking about immigrants as symbols, you know, as fear, as these things that are really about winning votes at the national level from people who don't live in diverse areas and who don't come into contact with immigrants. And so we're having this clash between cities becoming more intercultural and some countries where national governments are becoming very ideological on the questions of immigrant integration. And this is having an effect, actually, on our local communities. It's something that's really going to challenge Europe and other countries of immigration in the future.
How significant is that clash between the policies and practices at the national level and those pursued at local level, Thomas?
Well, so what's interesting is we really looked into that dynamic, and what we found is, you know, there are some areas where local authorities and national authorities can do the same things, you know? So in many of our countries, cities and our national governments can help us to find jobs because they offer services to us. They all might have a little role to play in the health sector and offering health services. They also are involved to different extents in the education sector, and in these areas we see that cities and national governments tend to think in a similar way. They tend to do similar things. But we see that there are some areas where if you take a local approach, you're probably going to have a very different way of thinking than the national government. So examples might be citizenship or local voting rights for immigrants. If you think about this in national politics, you start to again think about questions of fear and loyalty and power, and you start to think in very ideological terms. Whereas if you're in a place like here in Brussels, where a third of the population are foreigners, or in the neighborhood where I live in, half of the population are foreigners, you start to actually think about these issues more about democratic deficit, that actually the city authorities have no contact with the local population and they're not representing their interests. And it's starting to become a problem in how services are designed. So that's one area where we see a big opposition. But another is in access to rights and services. At the national level, you start to say, oh, well, we only want to give undocumented migrants access to this thing and asylum seekers access to that thing. And we're going to create a whole complicated set of legislation because it makes sense for all the political debates that we're having. Whereas at the local level, if you have someone who comes into your hospital and is sick, or you have someone who is homeless and they're undocumented, you want to actually serve them because no one in that neighborhood wants to see someone suffering. And so you have a much more pragmatic and inclusive approach. And it's in these types of areas where we see conflicts arising between a local intercultural approach to integration and some more national ideological approaches to integration.
Thomas, I read your report. It does read as an endorsement of the intercultural approach. So let me put this to you. Who is this research aimed at?
Well, we were really interested in looking at which elements of the intercultural approach really matter. The Council of Europe has been really extensive, trying to look at over 100 different ways that cities can become intercultural. And we were really interested, but which of those really matter, because a lot of these things, not everyone can do everything, right? And so we were really quite skeptical to see which of these elements are really core. And we found 6 core elements, which is basically arguing you need to have a core strategy. You need to have a unit that's going to try and make sure that all of the different city services are slowly changing the way that they approach things. You do need to have a budget and a plan to do that coordination. And you also need to make clear that you are a non-discriminating city, make sure that the people who you're buying services from also are not discriminating, and you need to make sure that you are getting citizens to participate. So you have to get ways to get citizens' feedback and find ways that you can actually go out and get people of all diverse backgrounds involved in your city policies. And we think that actually those core elements are the most important of an intercultural approach. And yes, we can always go another step, right? We can always be the best. But we think that it's very important to say that there are core simple things that any city of any size with any types of means can do, and that these things we found can actually be very beneficial for well-being and public attitudes in your city.
Given the fact that you've spent 1 year looking at this and analysing the data, let me put to you some of the tropes, some of the ideas that are repeated so often in popular press and certainly circulate on social media. So the classic ones are, Thomas, that the arrival of migrants increases rents, puts pressure on public housing, health services and school places. As a result, local authority spending increases as its revenue drops. Now, based on the data that you've analysed and the information that you've gathered over the last year, what is your experience on the ground telling you about some of those points?
Well, I do think that the cities and countries that don't have a well-developed intercultural approach and infrastructure fall behind. One of the big challenges that we have with immigration is we expect authorities to be responsive. If there's all of a sudden a lot of families who arrive or a lot of refugees who arrive, we need to know that the government is going to be able to respond. And we've particularly seen since 2015 that those cities and countries that didn't actually invest in having an intercultural approach and also an integration infrastructure, they couldn't respond. They quickly couldn't mobilize the resources that they needed and the volunteers that they needed to make sure that people got decent housing, to make sure people got language courses, to make sure that people were able to quickly get into work. And that lack of a response creates a negative cycle, right? If we're not prepared, then actually the public wants to see that asylum seekers, newcomers are well treated. We see this well in research. But if they see that that's not happening, then they start to have more negative attitudes, because then they start to say, hey, well, actually, we're not able to respond. They don't really realize, oh, actually, we're missing this integration infrastructure, intercultural infrastructure. When you have it there, it's good. It's usually not very visible. But when you also don't have it there, it's usually not that visible for the public. And then you start to see a negative spiral that happens. So what I would say there is that, yes, it's very important that we have these types of policies in place, usually to maintain public attitudes and to maintain well-being. And when we don't have it, we start to see a slippery slope where all of a sudden these issues become very politicized and we don't move forward.
Okay, well, let me take you up on that then. This is the first time I've heard efficiency being used as a reason for justifying the intercultural approach. Is that what the data is telling you, that cities that do adopt an intercultural approach tend to be more efficient when it comes to mobilizing public resources to deal with the arrival of newcomers?
Well, so one thing you can see is that cities that have some of these intercultural elements have the others. So we see that the cities that do the basic stuff, that have the plans, that have the strategies, these things that we would say exist on paper, are also the cities that usually have all the measures that they need to implement them well, right? So they have the budgets, they have the city authorities in different areas, so we can see that they have that infrastructure in place. And then secondly, what we did find is that the cities that had a stronger intercultural approach were also the places where the public tended to see their public authorities as more efficient and more trustworthy. And we even then tried to control for other factors that might explain public attitudes, like maybe this is a city that is very wealthy, maybe it's a place where there are a lot of highly educated people, and you would assume that they could, but even after controlling for that, there is that strong link. And so that builds on the concepts of the intercultural approach, which is let's use the existing resources that immigrants bring, that our public has, by also making our approach more participatory, so that we expect that, rather than just people coming to the city services and getting everything from the city, that the city finds a way to try and increase as much participation and interaction between immigrants and non-immigrants. That would be a more efficient approach.
Now, in your report, Thomas, this phrase "well-being" comes out many times. On that point, one of the common understandings about the arrival of newcomers in certain neighbourhoods, you've talked about your own in Brussels, is that people living in those communities, let's say the older residents, they begin to feel unsafe. Their well-being decreases. What's the data telling you about that?
Well, so what I would say is we've been at the Migration Policy Group doing lots of different types of studies that look at the links between policies and public opinion and what's driving public opinion. So I'm going to be speaking beyond this study for the ICC. But what we see is that we have very diverse areas, like the one that I live in, where you actually have a large immigrant population. Those places tend to actually have better integration infrastructure in place, and actually publics that are more open to immigrants. And it's not just people of immigrant background who live there who are more open to immigrants. It's also the non-immigrants who live in these very diverse areas who feel more open to immigrants. And the research also shows us that the more that immigrants are in contact with non-immigrants, and non-immigrants are in contact with immigrants, and the longer that immigrants are settled in a place, the more the public becomes open to immigrants. So what that tells us is that actually we have challenges when we have places that are new to immigration, when we have new cities that are starting to experience immigration, where they perceive that the immigrants are coming here, but maybe they don't really want to stay here. Maybe they didn't even want to come here in the first place. And where immigrants maybe are kept in separate housing or are really living in distinct areas. And we need to keep much more attention to these new places of immigration, because that's actually where it's really important that the city responds very quickly and starts to develop an intercultural approach. But what we see generally across Europe is that cities and countries come very late to the game. It's only really once they start to have a lot of immigrants in their cities, in their schools, in their hospitals, that they start to develop a plan. And so there's a lot of catching up and reactiveness in this areas, which is why our goal in this study, when we were looking at it, is if we find really interesting results, it's very important to communicate that there are lots of things that cities can do and that they should really think about it now.
Earlier in our conversation, I asked you who this report was addressed to, because one of the issues that become clear when there is this discussion about migration and what happens to neighbourhoods is this understanding of public perception. No matter what the data says, people tend to just decide, I believe this, what my experience is of my friends, my entourage confirms my understanding, and then those people tend to be impervious to data that you might produce or others might produce. So, in your report, Thomas, you refer to local intercultural policies being a significant driver behind local well-being and attitudes towards migrants. On this issue of public perception, then, can you give us some examples of what you're talking about when you say that?
No. I mean, what we also have to realize is that what each of us thinks about immigrants says more about who we are and what we think than it actually does about immigrants. Absolutely. So what I think about immigrants is largely predicted by things like how I was educated, who is in my family,
where you live,
my religion, where I grew up, what my religion is, what my political views are. That will pretty much predict my openness to immigrant integration. Now, there are, to a certain extent, ways that I can become more or less open. And that's very much driven by my context, what's really going on around me and how I understand what's going on around me. I travel across Europe all of the time, and in every place, people and authorities will all say, oh, we have problems, it's difficult, and they can't really appreciate the scale of the difficulty, that it's much more difficult in Greece, where they have no resources, no access to rights and services for many groups, than in Norway, where things are going very well on all metrics. So what's most important is, for shaping that movable part of people's minds on immigrants, is really public leadership. And that's what's so interesting in the findings from this ICC study, but also the findings that we've been doing at the national level from the Migrant Integration Policy Index, the MIPEX, where we found that if you have a national government that's really ambitious on immigrant integration and is publicly communicating about immigrant integration, you're more likely to see immigrants as an opportunity with skills, who deserve equal rights, and who bring cultural and economic benefits. Whereas if you're in a country where the government is restricting immigrants' rights and is not investing in immigrant integration, then actually people are much more likely to think that immigrants are threats, that don't bring anything, that don't deserve equal rights. So actually the way that public authorities, local and national, inform the public about immigrants actually can move people to thinking of immigrants more as an opportunity, as more of a threat. And that has an impact on actually the real opportunities that we create for immigrant integration, because I might be less likely to want to live near an immigrant or to hire an immigrant or to be nice to someone on the street. And that's a big challenge for a lot of our public authorities today, is that we can give as much evidence as possible about what the public really thinks and what policies work. But we were very keen in this report to try and communicate to local and national authorities to make clear that they have a role to communicate to the public. And that is going to mean a lot of tough public discussions, a lot of dealing with some prejudices, some myths, but also some real difficult realities, and engaging in those discussions. If public authorities, local or national, shy away from their responsibilities, then we're going to start to have a vicious cycle. We're not going to invest in integration. People are not going to understand each other, and we're going to end up in very divided and segregated societies.
So you're happy then that your research can be used in the political debate around migration so that, to coin a phrase, migrants are not perceived as being just a problem?
I think what's really interesting from this report is to show that an intercultural approach to integration makes clear that it's a two-way process, that what we are doing as members of the public, what our public authorities are doing at the local and national level, it not only affects immigrants, but also affects our own willingness to be involved in integration, whatever we think, whether we support assimilation, multiculturalism, interculturalism, what have you. So I think what's very important to make clear is that we have to ask what we are willing to do on intercultural integration.
Now, you cite Manchester, Berlin and Hamburg as being those cities which have the strongest intercultural policies. Give us an idea of what these cities are doing that sets them apart from other cities.
Well, so what you see here is you have strong leadership from the mayor's office already. So you have mayors who are willing to come out there and address public concerns, are not afraid, don't shy away from the difficult topics, but are also there trying to actually get immigrants and non-immigrants in mixed neighborhoods involved in their local life, really trying to go out there. For example, the mayor of Hamburg famously has written to everyone who could qualify for German citizenship and said, if you pass the tests, if you have met all the requirements, we would really like you to be a local citizen of Hamburg by becoming a German citizen, So not only do you see engagement from the mayor's office, but then you start to move below that to the things that we don't necessarily see as citizens, but where you start to see some coordination. So it means that you say, right, we're going to make sure that across all of our city services, we are going to be fighting anti-discrimination, and we're going to make sure that minorities are benefiting as much from what we have to offer as a city as non-immigrants. Manchester and a lot of British cities have been very strong on this to be equal opportunity employers, but also to engage in supplier diversity, to make sure that they're buying goods and services from businesses all across the city. And then they are asking those city services to figure out how they can open up. And that's going to be very different, from the health service to the education department to the local economic development department, but they have a general plan and they expect all of those city services to deliver, so that when you go to the different services in a city like Berlin or Hamburg or Manchester, you're going to be treated in a different way. It's not just when you go to the foreigners department that you might get someone who has some understanding of the fact that you're a newcomer to this place or you have a different background. You're going to get that more likely in all different city services.
And is your sense then, Thomas, that it is this intercultural approach which explains the success of these cities in dealing with newcomers, or could there be other factors? We talked earlier about the importance of national policies, of other forces that may well come to play. Are you saying that it's this intercultural approach which has given these cities, Manchester, Berlin, Hamburg, that this added advantage?
In the integration debate, we often get too philosophical and ideological. So I think what's most important to do is to look at walking the talk, right? So it was really interesting for us to see what is a strong intercultural city. And it's not just based on what they put in press releases, right? It's actually based on how they're changing the way that they're working. And you'll see, if you go from country to country, that the words that people use, the concepts they use might be a bit different, right? Some are going to talk about non-discrimination, others are going to talk about equal opportunities, others are going to talk about new citizens, others are going to talk about multiculturalism or diversity. What's less important than the words is about what you're doing to create participation and interaction between immigrants and non-immigrants and to open up your city services. That's really the most important.
Now, I've got to put this to you. People will listen to what you say, Thomas, and they will say, this researcher has conducted research over 1 year. He was invited so to do by the Intercultural Cities Network, and he's produced a report that says the intercultural approach works and is delivering results. For those people, it will sound too much like who pays the piper calls the tune. How would you respond to that criticism, Thomas?
Well, I mean, what I would note is that the Migration Policy Group is an independent think tank. We do the results and we do the methodology as we would like, without any interference from anyone who commissions our research. And what I would note is, we are showing that an intercultural approach can definitely help boost outcomes. It's not the magic bullet. It's not the only thing. Immigrant integration is a very complicated process that is based on the local context, the types of immigrants you have, the types of people who are receiving immigrants, the time and that it takes, a long-term process. So it's not as if it's the only solution, but it's very important that we are using the best methods that are out there in statistics to try and show what can tend to have a positive impact. And here we're really talking, as I said, about what generally makes you feel good in your local life, what generally you feel about immigrants. It doesn't mean that there are no individual problems, no individual challenges. Absolutely not. But I think it's really important that we start to expect that our governments actually are responding to immigrant integration and are giving us that infrastructure so that we can respond.
In your research, Thomas, you refer to the Intercultural Cities indicators on the 5 dimensions. I think you've spoken about them previously. One of those was the mainstreaming of interculturalism. How do you think that can be achieved?
Well, again, I think it's by not approaching these debates on integration in an ideological manner. Right? So it's not about saying, look, we have this brilliant concept that we've gotten from academics or from international institutions or from a best practice somewhere abroad. We practically want to make sure that our services are working in a certain way, however you phrase that in your local context, and then passing that over to all of your partners. So what can you do? Right? So what can the education department do? What can the Health and Human Services Department do? What can housing do? They all can't do the same thing. They all can't work with the same concepts because the way that cities improve our lives differ very much depending on what services they are. So what's really a challenge in trying to mainstream this is working with people so that they come up with their own ideas about how they can be more inclusive, more participatory, how they can better understand all of the diversity of their local residents, and just trying to continue to work with them over time to become more and more ambitious. Where mainstreaming usually fails is where we want some kind of quick, ready-made solution, and we turn to some expert or some specialized office in the city administration, and we expect them to come up with the solution for everyone else. Then there's not as much buy-in, and there's not as much change on the ground.
Another ICC indicator that you refer to, Thomas, is the dedicated intercultural strategy and budget. Let me now just go to that latter point. Is it your view that the intercultural strategy leads to a better and more efficient use of resources? Because again, it seems to be the two are always mentioned in the same sentence: newcomers plus expenses, resources, etc., etc. There's always this concern that newcomers are going to add to the local and national budget. So, does the data tell you, Thomas, that by adopting an intercultural approach, we use resources better and more efficiently?
Well, so what we do see is that, let's say, a budget only works as a part of a whole. So if you just try to throw money at a problem, but you don't have a plan, you don't have a strategy, you don't have a buy-in of all of the services and of your citizens, then your money might go to waste because you actually haven't made a very efficient choice. And that's been a concern since 2015 with the large-scale arrivals, that many countries and cities have not been prepared. They've had to quickly come up with solutions, emergency solutions, and of course, when something's an emergency, money is more likely to flow very quickly. And we don't come up with the right solutions. We don't actually realize what are the real needs of these people, who could best serve them, and so we have inefficient and ineffective solutions. So what we find is that, yes, it's important to have a budget, but it's only actually one component, as we say, of having these intercultural services. You need to have a plan. You need to have a strategy. You need to have everybody on board, because then they'll actually have reviewed and they'll know what they're spending their money on most appropriately. And I wanted to also add, the intercultural approach is all about participation between citizens. So that also means that the city is not going to be the only one coming up with the solution. It means the city is going to be working with local employers and the Chamber of Commerce. It's going to be working with other major businesses, local universities, local neighborhood associations. And that means that actually those actors are going to be able to come together with the city, and all of them together are going to figure out really who's best to do what. We've seen since 2015 a massive outpouring of volunteers under the banner of refugee welcome. I mean, millions of Europeans have donated their time, their money, their goods in order to help refugees. But we have to be honest, in some of those cases, since there was no plan and no infrastructure in place, some of that goodwill has gone to waste. It's really only in places, for example, like Berlin, or Barcelona, where the city was able to say, hold on, it's great that you have all this goodwill, but let's figure out who should be doing what so that we make sure that volunteers are getting properly trained and are getting actually given tasks that they can do and to support the professionals, and the professionals are only doing what they need to do, right? So if you have an intercultural participatory approach, you're going to be able to use the resources of your city and of your civil society better.
Finally then, Thomas, what is the one big takeaway from this report that you hope will convince local and national policymakers to move in this intercultural direction?
I think that we are in a very divided Europe. We're in very divided societies, even within our own countries. And we've often thought that the intercultural approach is something that only belongs to certain types of people who think in certain types of ways. That's where we were really interested in doing this study all across Europe. We have cities in the southwest of Europe, in the north of Europe, in the southeast of Europe, in Eastern Europe. We have small cities, large cities, all with very different histories of immigration, large immigrant cities, small immigrant cities. And we still found that there is this positive benefit from rethinking how you work as a city. So we really were impressed by the fact that cities can all find their own ways of moving ahead. It's not just a certain way of thinking that's required in order to start becoming intercultural.
Thomas Huddleston, thank you.
Thank you very much.